Hello everyone, my name is Sydney Frandsen and I work at TechSmith, which is where you currently are. If you're not familiar with TechSmith and what we do here, we are a software company that specializes in visual communication software. So the two that you've probably recognized are Snagit and Camtasia. Snagit is a lightweight screen capture software and editing software, and then Camtasia is a video editing software. So this presentation is my experiential report of working on desktop software where we tie our releases to a heavy marketing push. So although I do think that there is value in this for people who are in either a subscription model or software as a service, I want to give the caveat that this is my report of working on desktop software where we do more annual releases instead of continuously deploying, that kind of thing. Let's see. Cool. So before I jump into my presentation, I did want to give a really short demo of what you can do in Camtasia just to level set on some context of what I'm talking about. So I have worked on the Camtasia team for almost 3 years now, and Camtasia is a video editing software where what we're trying to do is make it easy for users to create really polished content quickly and being able to repeat that. So we want to help our users make videos that make them look very good to either their bosses or the people they share these videos with internally, while also not taking up as much time with very minute tweaks and polish and that kind of thing. So here is a video of, yes, cool. That's really cool. So one thing that we like to do to make it easy for people, this is something called a quick property asset. So we're trying to make it so that you can create intros and outros without a lot of overhead from the user. So I added this asset and then I went and added my own text. This is themed about CodeMash because I'm going to be presenting this presentation in a couple of weeks at CodeMash, so that's the branding colors. But I was able to very quickly create this intro with my name and potentially a company name or a title within my company with very little overhead that I could repeat this process and get the same really polished result very easily. Cool. So as we gear up for these annual releases, it's really important to the Camtasia team that we nail that first customer interaction, because our reputation with our customers is what keeps them coming back for more releases and more features. And we also have a very good reputation with our customers, and we like to keep that word of mouth going as we do releases and as we put out new features. So historically, as we want to ensure the quality of that first-time experience, historically what we've done is leading up to the release, we would do what we would call full regression testing. So what this would look like is we would spend a couple of weeks and we would iterate over all the different features in the product, all the different potential states that the product could be in, and we would write out test cases so that we could make sure that everything worked the way that we expected it to. But when you're working with a software as complicated as Camtasia or Snagit, where you're capturing the screen, you're doing edits on that, you're producing, you're sharing to all kinds of different locations, iterating through all those combinations quickly becomes very expensive. And that's expensive in the preparation, that's expensive in the execution of those test cases, and also in triaging the issues that come out of that type of testing. So what you're seeing on the screen now is one page in a series of pages in a spreadsheet that includes these test cases, all these different states. I took this from an internal spreadsheet. And this particular page has 182 test cases, and it's one of 40 in this spreadsheet. So to do our release testing in this manner, we would have to iterate through all of those cases and then process through what comes out of that. So as you can tell, it's going to get very, very expensive. So what I already just talked about, I did mention some of the cons of full regression testing, which is the expensive part of it, and then also it's not very practical to go through all those test cases. But a big thing is that it also doesn't guarantee that the highest priority issues are found, because you could end up with a list of 100 minor issues that are not actually important to your users. It's no guarantee that you're going to find the things that would really trip up your users and ruin that first time experience with them. But there are pros to doing release testing in this manner. So it does shake out a lot of issues. You do have a very good idea of the state of your product, and it does output very clear documentation of what was tested and what was not. So you can go back and look at that post-release and be able to have confidence in what exactly was tested. So although there are pros for this, when you're getting into a video editor like Camtasia, the ways that you can combine those features, the different states of the product that you can end up with, quickly became too much for us to think that this was the best solution for regression testing for us. And so that's when we switched over to scenario testing. So has anybody heard of scenario testing before? I'm seeing some hands, Okay, so I'm pulling all of this from a paper entitled An Introduction to Scenario Testing by Ken Kamer. So I would recommend everybody going and reading that. It dives a lot more into what scenario testing is, and I'm going to kind of go more at a high level. And one second. I'm going to go more at a high level and then talk about how we implemented that for us on the Camtasia team. Go ahead.
Do you have a link to this document?
I do not, but I can send one that can go out with the last, once the video goes out to the meetup group.
Okay.
Yeah. So, scenario testing is a powerful exploratory testing technique that uncovers bugs that your users actually care about. So, the whole idea behind it is that you are putting yourself into the head of your users and you're trying to perform actions and accomplish goals that your users actually would be trying to, which means that the bugs that you produce from this are going to matter to your users and are going to be very valuable to you prior to your release. So some of the things that your scenario tests should have are they should be based, I'm going to read through these and then dive into a couple of them. So they should be based on a story, they should be motivating, they should be credible, they should involve a complex use of the program, and they should also be easy to evaluate. So when I say based on a story, I mean that should be based on the story of how your product would actually be used by your users. And that should include what goal they're trying to accomplish and what's motivating them toward that goal. So for example, Camtasia, I already mentioned, is a video editor where we're trying to help people make repeatable, consistent content because people want to make very sharp videos, but they don't want to spend a lot of time on that. They want to look good, but they don't want to have to spend 8 hours making very frame by frame, pixel by pixel edits. And so then when I say motivating, I already mentioned motivation, so that's a little bit of blurring of that particular word. But when I say motivating, I actually mean that the scenario should be motivating for stakeholders. So it should, if an issue comes out of this scenario test, your stakeholders should be bought into the idea that you should fix it because you've hit it as a user. They have to believe that your users would actually hit this issue as well. And that's what I mean by credible. It should be known that not only could your users hit this, they probably will hit this issue that comes out of a scenario test. So, let me back up. I wanted to give an example of the difference between a motivating and a non-motivating type of scenario. So for instance, Camtasia, the video editor, something that would not be motivating for stakeholders to fix is a scenario where you're going frame by frame, pixel by pixel, making very small changes, spending hours on a particular video, because that's not the user that we're trying to target with Camtasia. So that would not be a motivating scenario. But what would be a motivating scenario is a bug that affects incorporating your corporate logo into your video. If that scenario did not work, your stakeholders are really going to want to fix that because we think that a user would hit that issue. So when I say complex use of the program, there's also, it could be a complex environment or a complex set of data that you're inputting into the program as well. And then easy to evaluate easy to evaluate just means that it should be clear whether or not your scenario has failed based on the outcome of it. So, as we implemented scenario testing as a release activity for our teams, as we were doing this, what did we identify as the key ingredients for a successful activity? And so when I say a successful activity, it's kind of twofold in that, which is that it does produce the issues that your users would care about. It does give an accurate representation of the quality of your release. But also, a successful activity is something that's not really soul-crushing, and your development team that's going to be participating, they don't dread doing it again. They are bought into the value that it produces, and they have a good time doing it as well. So that's kind of what we deemed success. So I'm going to read through these, and we're actually going to dive into each of them. So the key ingredients for success are clear instructions, shared documentation for test coverage, a kickoff meeting, good motivation, coverage assessment, triaging the discovered issues, and a team share of the results. So diving into the first one, instructions. So your instructions should include a lot of things, first being housekeeping items. And by this I mean, where can your testers locate the build that you're wanting them to use? What features do you want them to turn on or off if you have a feature switching mechanism? What is the timing of the activity? When does it start? Are you providing meals? What time do those start? When does it end? That kind of thing. Are people working in teams or are they working alone? How should they be documenting their testing, and where should they be logging bugs? Things like that. Does anybody have any other ideas of things that should be included in the housekeeping category of your instructions?
Maybe what OS or browser people should be using?
Yeah, that's a very good one. Anybody else have any other ideas? Okay. So your instructions should also include your persona. So the persona within the scenario is who you're trying to get your testers to think as. So I've already mentioned Camtasia, the video editor. Our persona is a marketer, a marketing professional who makes videos at a small to medium company, and they have some video experience. They know what a good marketing video looks like, but they don't have the experience to go all the way with Adobe Premiere Pro and do all that fine-tuning, really slick special effects, but they still want to look good. So that's an example of a persona that we have used. And your persona should include the experience level with your product and the motivation for the work that they're trying to get done. And then your instructions should finally include the scenario, the specific scenario that your testers are going to be using, which I'll repeat should be based on a story, motivating, credible, involve a complex use of your program, and be easy to evaluate. So I have a little bit more about how you decide on the persona. So I Googled professional woman, and she's who came up. So this is Cheryl. Cheryl works at a marketing company, and it's a company of about 30 to 40 people. She knows what a video is supposed to look like. She knows like gradients are very 1990s. Apparently drop shadows are out too, is what I learned this morning. She knows all that information. And so Cheryl and her persona and her skills and her experience and her motivations, that's who we asked our testers to get into the headspace of. But how did we decide on Cheryl? So you can use the historical knowledge of your user base. So Camtasia is 16 years old. We have a lot of information about how people use Camtasia, whether that's from customer calls or forum posts or social media interactions, seeing people's results. We do have that historical data about our user base. We also could use product usage analytics. So we do have analytics about what our most used features are. So you can factor that into building your persona. And then also, as I've already mentioned, a big thing for us is that we have our releases paired with a very heavy marketing push. So if you already know what story you're trying to tell in the marketplace, you should factor that into how you're testing because you want that story to be successful for your users. So for the release that we used Cheryl's persona, all of our stories were around that repeatable, consistent content. So we made sure that we could really hit the nail on the head for that marketing message and incorporated that into our persona. So once you have your instructions, which include all those housekeeping items, the personas, and the specific scenarios, which I'll give you some examples later on in the presentation, you do need a way, including in your instructions, on how to demonstrate your test coverage. So it is a misconception that if you're moving from the full regression spreadsheet that does output very minute test cases and output the results of those, that if you're moving to scenario and more of an exploratory method, that you lose that documentation. We have found a way to be able to demonstrate test coverage while still using exploratory methods. And so this is an example of the new spreadsheet, still spreadsheet, but a new spreadsheet of demonstrating test coverage. It's going a little bit fast, but I don't really need you guys to see the actual text. I just want to draw attention to the components of it. So we have sections for larger features. We've kind of gone through the product and we've bubbled up the big things, the overall categories, and those will have a line. But then for a specific new feature, something that we really want to make sure that we nail, we break that feature out into more specific and smaller test cases. Still not to the level of button presses, states of the product, that kind of thing, but more high level, these are actions you should be able to perform with this feature. And so then once we have those large categories and the broken down features, we kind of do a choose your own adventure method of recording your testing. So you can see right here, this column, which is going to cycle back to the top. I chose a bad column to show you because this person clearly didn't hit very many test cases. You'll see passes and failures. So as you're going through and using different features, you can log your test results using these passes and failures based on, did you use this feature? Did it work the way you expected to? Go ahead and mark that as a pass. And then we have conditional formatting to turn those cells green. But if you did find an issue within that feature, within that action, add a failure and then link to the issue report that you've logged. So then as people add their columns for their own testing, we aggregate the results of each feature action into this column, which also has formatting on it. So you can see that the green cells are ones that our threshold has been hit of people who have tested that, and we think that that's good to go. We've gotten coverage on that. And then the red cells are either features that had failures on them or features that just haven't been hit by testing. So those are able to be very quickly visually picked out of like where the gaps in our testing are right now. So this is an example of how we demonstrate test coverage. And so as I've already mentioned, we do the shared spreadsheet with the large areas of the product separated out, and then breaking down some select features that we really want to make sure that we nail. Doing the choose your own adventure approach. And then one thing that I didn't mention as I was showing you the example is that some of those red rows or things that we don't think are going to be hit by our scenarios, but we do want to make sure they are going to be tested and verified, we bubble down to what we call a QA verify section. So those are kind of the things that don't really line up with your scenario. Nobody's going to hit them, but if it broke, you would hear about it in support. So QA can double back to that section and make sure that those are working as expected without having to burden the team with something that doesn't make sense in their new persona. So I do have an example. So this top part is the more high-level features. So you can see that the captions feature, only one person use that within their scenario, within their persona. So that would be something that would end up in the QA section to go back through and verify. But then theming, which is a feature that allows you to incorporate your corporate branding or your logos, fonts, that kind of thing, that was a new feature that we really wanted to nail. So we did break that down into more specific actions that we wanted people to perform. So once you have your instructions crafted, you've decided how you're going to demonstrate your test coverage, you've written out your persona, you've come up with all these scenarios for people to use. Another huge thing that we have found is essential is the kickoff meeting for the event. So the way that we've run this testing event, it's been 2 days of people doing the activity, and we start out those 2 days with an actual kickoff meeting where there's a lot of things that you should do at the kickoff meeting. And I'm going to go through those in a second. But the kickoff meeting, the reason that we found it to be so essential is that it provides you an opportunity to get people hyped up. It provides you an opportunity to explain to them why you're switching from all those minute test cases into something that's a little bit more open-ended, what value you're hoping to get out of that, which is that you're getting more credible issues and higher priority issues bubbled up quickly. And it also allows you to level set on the timing of the event. So something that we found when we didn't have a kickoff meeting is that people tend to trickle in and out of the event. They kind of plug in for a little bit and then an email pops up, I want to handle that kind of thing. So if you level set on the start time and the stop time, that definitely helps people stay engaged. So at your kickoff meeting, you should go over the instructions in person. You should talk about all the things that I mentioned in the instructions. I do recommend sending a follow-up email with all that information a second time, immediately following the kickoff meeting so that people have that in their hands for the remainder of the activity. You should present the persona, so you should get up there and talk about Cheryl. You should talk about Cheryl's experience level with your product. You should talk about what she's trying to accomplish, what are her motivations, what is her deadline if she has one, that type of thing, which you should give them a deadline because you do have a stop to your activity. And it also gives people in the in-person meeting, it gives people an opportunity to form teams and kind of collaborate in that area. And then you should provide all the scenarios in that meeting as well so that people can choose which scenario they're going to execute on. I will give the caveat that our team does have about 85% in-person on-site teammates, and then we have a couple of people who are remote. So prior to this kickoff meeting, I reached out to those remote people, gave the instructions ahead of time, and also gave them the opportunity to have first dibs on the scenarios just because they're already kind of at a disadvantage in the process. So I wanted them to have a little bit of a level set there. So a big thing that I mentioned in the kickoff meeting is that it allows you to hype up the event, get people bought in. So a big way that you can get people engaged in your event and continuing to contribute to it, continuing to work toward the scenario that you've provided for them, is that you have to be able to drive engagement with the event. So one thing that we have found, we've tried a lot of different things, we found this to be the most successful, is that there should be a competition involved. There should. But that competition should not be reliant upon bug count or discovered bug count. And it also, there should be a prize involved, but that prize should have absolutely no value. They should not, so it has to be something that people would like to work toward, but wouldn't be mad if they don't get. Because if your competition is based on bug count, first of all, you're going to end up getting a bunch of minor issues that people can get their counts up, which is the exact opposite of what you're trying to accomplish by switching to this type of release testing. But also, people are going to start getting hurt feelings on you saying either, well, that bug is not important to us, or, oh, I logged that one and didn't realize someone else logged it first. Do I get the points? That kind of thing. That's not really what you're trying to do. You're not trying to produce a bunch of minor issues. You're trying to think like your users would and discover whether or not that was a good experience. So, for example, the motivation, the thing that's driving you through the scenario, it should be very closely tied to the scenario. So I've already mentioned our persona, Cheryl. She's a marketer. She's trying to produce a really polished marketing video on a deadline that she was given, a pretty short deadline. So for us, our competition was about the video produced. We ended up at the end of the 2 days having a little film festival, and we watched everyone's videos, and we had our actual marketing department come in and judge the videos based on like best picture, best editing, funniest, like that kind of thing. And then the prize was a toy dinosaur that we spray painted gold. So I have this sitting on my desk still. I got the Team Spirit Award because I organized it and didn't win. But the people who won awards at this event, they still have them on their desk. They probably don't look at them very often. They don't think about them. Maybe they do and feel pride. But the people who didn't get one are not hurt by that. So you want the competition to have the prize to have no value. One anecdotal story is that we came to this conclusion after making some mistakes. Before I started at TechSmith, my mentor had run a similar type of event where the competition was about bug counts, and the prize was like a $5 gift card to Bigby. But people got really passionate about their bug counts, about what they were finding, and apparently it was a disaster. So now we try not to make it something where people will have their feelings hurt if they don't get it. And a big thing that I have kind of alluded to throughout this is that the scenario should harness your team's creativity. So a lot of the motivation behind this type of testing activity is that your team is very creative. They're problem solvers. They like to express themselves. And so it should harness that because that's going to keep them engaged. Having them have an opportunity to express themselves and really think through what final result they're trying to produce is going to keep them engaged. So this is a short one. An essential part of this type of activity is having a coverage assessment. So what this looks like for our team is we gather the testers on the team after people have gone through their scenario, they finished their video, and we pull up the spreadsheet that I showed you earlier, and then we'll look at like, okay, what are the red cells? What do we need to pay more attention to? How was our test coverage through this experience or through this testing activity? And then deciding on any needed action items based on how you assess your coverage. So those action items can be about cells that just didn't get enough testing. There wasn't enough coverage. We need to circle back around to those. They could be areas that produced a lot of issues where we're not really sure, did we find them all? That warrants a little bit more investigation. Or it could be investigating things that were intermittent or not very easily reproducible by the team, making sure that we have a good understanding of how things were tested and the quality of those things. And then after you have assessed your coverage and come up with those action items, you do need to triage the things that are discovered because hopefully you do discover issues. Hopefully you do find things that your users are going to hit before your users hit them. So this is a little bit different than a typical triage. For us, our triages have taken many different forms, and sometimes they tend to be a little bit getting into potential solutions, which is not necessarily the place for that, or squabbling about priority when we're not going to immediately move it into a sprint, that kind of thing. So for this particular triage, you do need the key stakeholders, you do need the people who are supposed to be making these decisions present, but it needs to be very high velocity, and it needs to be very clear cut on what the status of the release is. So what I like to do when I'm running this type of triage, every time we bring up an issue that was discovered during this activity, I like to ask the question, would you stop the release to fix this issue? Is this valuable enough to delay the release to fix this issue? So as people kind of get off track, or they're talking about like, oh, we'll pull this in first or second after the release, what is the priority of this? Bring it back to the question, would you stop the release for this issue? Because if you always center it around that question, when you come out of this particular triage, you're going to have a very clear status on what still needs to be done before your release is ready to go. You can circle back around to those issues you say, no, we're not going to stop the release for this, and you should circle back around to them with your regular triage process. But the point of this meeting is to very quickly understand where your release is at. And then finally, once you have your test coverage and you have your action items and you have your list of show-stopping issues, the things that you would stop the release for, you do need to do some sort of share out. And the share out should be twofold. It should include all the things that I just talked about, the kind of logistical elements of the activity, but it should also share out the results of your scenarios. So this was really fun for the Camtasia team because our scenarios involved making videos. And I already mentioned we ended up doing a film festival where we ended up watching all these videos and then having an award ceremony, and people came up and gave speeches accepting their rewards, that kind of thing. We had popcorn and candy. It was very fun. So I do have an example of, this is the video that I created when we did this particular activity. So Cheryl, I'm Cheryl. I have some video experience. Oh, that's a microphone. So I have some video experience. I have a really tight deadline. I've just been handed this project, and I worked at Instagram, and I needed to create a product demo of the Boomerang application, which, if you are not familiar with it, is this really cool app where you take a video and it does it forward and then it does it back, and then it does it forward and then it does it back. So if you're like jumping in the air or you're like throwing confetti, it ends up producing a really cool result. So here is my marketing video that I created in about 2 hours because I wanted to make it very quickly, but I wanted it to be polished. I really wanted to get into Cheryl's mindset, and this is what I came up with. That's loud. How do I turn it down? Still really loud. So that was the result of my scenario. And so we had people who, they worked at GitHub and they had to do a product demo of the new boards feature. We had people who worked at Spotify and had to do a demo of the application. We had one group who we wanted to give people as many or as little guardrails as they wanted. So some people chose very specifically stated scenarios. One group chose choose your own adventure physical product, and they created a marketing video for a roll of tape, and it was so funny, and I think they won funniest video. So we came together and we had the team share out where we we watched what people produced from their scenarios, which did help motivate them because they knew people were going to be seeing the results of this. They were bought into doing their absolute best to be Cheryl. So you should show the results of the scenarios, and then you should share all of the logistical items, which are how your test coverage metrics turned out, what show-stopping issues were discovered, and then action items going forward. So I did already mention some of the scenarios. The one that the working at GitHub and needing to do a demo of the project boards feature. One show-stopping issue that we discovered from that scenario was that Camtasia would crash, just completely crash. If you started a new project after adding a cursor effect, so something that would highlight your cursor on the screen, if you had made a cut and then stitched together a screen recording. So in Camtasia, you take a screen recording, you say, oh, I don't want this 10 seconds, I'm going to cut that out, and then we merge the two pieces that you've cut on the edges together. If you then wanted to highlight your cursor and then start a new project, Camtasia would crash. We never would have found that if we were going through all of these minute test cases, because who comes up with that other than someone who is Cheryl using your product the way that you want Cheryl to use it. So to go over what I've already talked about and repeating them, these are the things that we found made us most successful in a scenario testing activity for teams. So you need clear instructions, a shared document for your test coverage. You need a kickoff meeting that ties in a very strong motivation to keep people in the activity. You need coverage assessment. You need to triage the issues that come out of it. And then you need to share out the results of the activity. Does anybody have any thoughts, questions, concerns, quips about the things that we identified as the key ingredients?
So one question I had was, I would imagine you would do this every release, which I don't know exactly how often that is.
So we have done this for our major releases and our minor releases. Sometimes we'll send out like bug fix releases. Those don't necessarily get the full activity, but I would say we do this probably every 4 to 6 months.
Okay. So then do you change the persona each time, or is it the same? Because a lot of this stuff, it's like you could do some crazy persona, but then like for the set of tests that you're trying to do that are always kind of, a package of what you want to regress. I would imagine the persona wouldn't change that much each time.
Yeah, so the persona has evolved a little bit. I would say from like a major release where we're kickstarting some new features, and then a minor release where we're coming back to those and we're adding some functionality to them. You would want those personas to be similar. Obviously, you need to find some way to keep it fresh, which is where the scenarios and the different scenarios can come in. But we did end up using a marketer type of persona. I named her Cheryl. We actually use Marcus, which is an acronym that stands for something I can't remember. Marketer, he has a lot of letters. Anyway, Cheryl. We would use a Cheryl type character persona for many releases, but we have switched it up based on really trying to keep things fresh, trying to make sure that people are still excited and not just like going through the motions, because people will, if you repeat this kind of thing, they'll just like start going through the motions. So one example is that the most recent time we did this type of activity, we were actually creating, I don't play video games. Clint, what was the name of this? Your start screen in an arcade game?
Oh yeah, that's what we had everybody do an attract mode for arcade games.
Attract
so like
mode.
where you've got like the title screen and then like 10 seconds of gameplay and then like the high scores and stuff.
Yeah, so things that for that particular testing activity, we were really focused on how things are rendered. So we really wanted to be into the nitty-gritty of that. So that's how we created the persona, that kind of thing. Yeah. Does anybody else have any questions?
Earlier you mentioned that you've had some remote people as well as in-house people doing a scenario testing. Have you noticed any pluses or minuses for the remote people?
So I think that there are pluses and minuses for remote work in general. It's really hard to make sure that things are equal when most of the team is in the room and some people are gone. So it is just something that you have to focus on in terms of, as we were doing the film festival, like, is our audio going through to the remote people, or are they just like watching the screen with no music or no voices and that kind of thing? Something that I did find that helped was pairing up the remote people with each other, because they're already used to working remote together, so they already kind of have gotten through some of the hurdles of communication that would entail. It does stink that they weren't able to get popcorn for their film festival, although I secretly hope that someone popped their own bag. Yeah. So after we did this event the first time, I actually did run a retrospective with the team that participated in it, just to see what people's reaction was, because it was so different from doing the spreadsheet of full regression test cases. And we got a lot of really great feedback. I ended up using the two categories of wow and what if. So for the wow categories, these are some quotes from that retro, which is, most of the team was actually engaged and participating compared to previous testing activities. This was fun and didn't feel prescribed, and it felt like we encountered real user experience, not just bugs or broken functionality. So that was really encouraging going forward, because it kind of showed that trying to get people engaged in this and excited about it we did have payoff in that motivation for us. And then some what ifs is, what if the scenarios gave specific features to use? So this particular tester wanted a little bit more guardrails on what they were supposed to be doing. And then what if we performed the activity as individuals instead of groups, which we did act upon, because you do want hands on the keyboard people in your product, although there is something to be said for trying to collaborate and have eyes on the screen, eyes on the keyboard, pairing in that way. So we did give the option for people to participate as individuals instead of in groups the next time that we did the activity. So I understand that, oh, I jumped the gun, I was looking at this instead of that. So key takeaways for implementing scenario testing for your release strategy versus a full regression spreadsheet and matrix and that kind of thing is that, before I get into them, I do want to give a caveat, which is that Camtasia, a video editor, is not going to kill anyone if something goes wrong. If you make like air traffic control software, I want you to run through every single test case, because that's important and people could die. So for our context, where we make a tool where people can do a lot of different things and it's not life or death, in our context with our complex program that you can layer features in so many different combinations, exploratory testing makes a lot of sense for us. So that's my caveat. Key takeaways, though, are that we do think that scenario testing is better than the full regression, because the issues that it produces are high priority to your users. So you do get a very good idea of how your users are going to experience your release prior to that release. And the next key takeaway is that it is a misconception that if you switch from full regression to exploratory testing, you lose documentation. You can still demonstrate test coverage using an exploratory method by doing it at a more high level. And then finally, the most important ingredient for success, which, as I defined earlier, is not only clear output on the quality of your release, but also an activity that people would want to stay engaged in and want to come back and do again, not dread it the next time. The key ingredient for that is driving their engagement, driving their motivation, making sure that you're engaging their creativity. Okay. So I do understand, though, that not everyone makes super cool, really fun to use video editing software. I'm very lucky in that regard to work on such a fun product. So I did come up with some examples of personas and scenarios for different types of software, but I kind of wanted to do this as more of a group activity to see if we could come up with personas and scenarios for something that's not a video editor. So the first example is a moving company website. Does anybody have an idea of what you would have as a persona for a moving company website?
Someone who's never used a moving company before.
So the persona would be someone who is moving for the first time, having never hired out a company. And what kinds of scenarios would you want to make sure that your users are going to be successful in? I have some crazy ones, but...
We actually don't work on the marketing side. That's our marketing area.
Gotcha.
Basic stuff,
So one thing that if I were working at a moving company website, a scenario that I would want to make sure worked as a user is that if I hired a moving company and they have a tire blowout in Nebraska driving from California to Ohio, is that going to work? Is your system going to support that? Like AAA coming out, moving the container from one semi to the other semi, and then things like insurance or what if something gets damaged, like those types of things. Those are things that your users really care about that you would want to make sure worked prior to release. So another that sounds mean to say, less fun than a video editor type of software that people test would be insurance software. So I worked at an insurance company for 3.5 years, and our software, our customers were actually internal customers. We made software for our own systems. So what would the types of personas be or scenarios be for insurance software?
It would probably be related to maybe departments. So like if you're in claims, there'd be like a claims adjuster person or a claims call center person. Or if you're doing, new insurance policies, whoever is a processor for that, personas like that.
Yeah. The idea that Clint gave me was that if you have a tree fall on your car, and your car is catapulted into your garage, and your garage is set on fire, is your insurance policy or your insurance software going to be able to handle that series of events? Because if I'm a user and that happens to me, I'm definitely going to care whether or not your software is able to support that. And then maybe something less software related, if you make hardware that connects to a computer for like custom controls. So there are pieces of like $100,000 hardware that help you to edit, like make movie trailers or that kind of thing. One example that I heard a couple of days ago actually was that this tester discovered that when he pushed his chair back on the carpet, the hardware wasn't grounded correctly, so it would send static electricity through and like fry the hardware. So like those types of scenarios are a little bit funny to laugh at, but your user's really going to care if their $100,000 piece of hardware doesn't function correctly if they're getting up from their desk. So like there's a lot of different ways that you can implement this and different ways that you can apply this to your context, even if you don't make very interesting video editing software. So that is all that I have for you guys. Does anybody have any comments or questions?
For your scenario testing, do you ever bring in non-team members? It's like maybe people from tech support or...
Yeah, so we have contemplated specifically like marketing people, like people in our marketing department participating. And we have done kind of a team swap type of thing where like I work on the Camtasia team. We've designed this activity, but we're going to have the Snagit team execute on it just to get some fresh eyes on it. So I think that you definitely can have people not on your team participate. You just have to be very explicit in giving them context and like so the Camtasia team has a lot of implicit knowledge about Cheryl. We've been working on the product for a number of years. We've been pushing these features out. We know how those features are woven into our overall story. So if you're trying to get people who have not had all of that historical context of what you're trying to accomplish. You just need to make sure that you're very clear about the persona and how that fits into the marketing messages and the motivation behind that so that you can have a successful event.
Another question is, when creating personas, have you or do you use customer support or tech support?
I have not personally, but I think that's a very good idea. We work really closely with our support staff. We have a really tight loop in terms of feedback that if they're getting a lot of calls and support, it's pretty closely tied to getting those types of things out the door. So we do loop them in. They're one of the quote unquote stakeholders for the triage process. So they're definitely involved in the output of the activity. They're making sure that when we say we're going to have a quality release, support is a very big factor in defining what a quality release is, because there are people who are going to be answering the calls if it's not. So in that sense, we do very heavily involve them, but having them inform the type of persona is not something that I had considered before. That's a good idea.
Got T-Rex arms over here. So one question I have, and I guess, I don't know what your automation status is, but I guess my question is, you have the initial spreadsheet with all of just steps versus scenarios. When you go to approach the automation, which one do you prefer to automate? Just each step? Or, hey, let's actually do like a scenario automated?
Yeah, so I think that the answer, like the cookie cutter answer, is that we would want both. But I think that Camtasia is 16 years old. It's desktop software it's very hard to keep up to date when things are moving so quickly. So it's not the easiest to get automation around, especially when you get to the scenario type of automation, because it's so complicated and you can change the orders of your actions and come out with different results, that kind of thing. So scenarios are pretty hard to automate within our context versus this very clear input, this is the output. That would be a lot easier to automate, and it does still provide value because you do want those things to work. But for us, the scenario testing fills a gap that we're not able to fill with automation. Anybody else? Okay, and I'm like right at time. So thank you, everyone.